history and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. We're so grateful that you could join us. And over the next 2 hours, we're going to cover a lot of different topics. In about a half an hour, we're going to be talking about some of these historic sites in America. The Heritage Foundation has been actually evaluating their historical accuracy. And I'll just hold up two of the booklets we've sent out most recently. One having to do with One Nation Under God, which was the September issue. The other one, the Bill of Rights, which is the October issue. And, of course, we will be doing a lot more in that regard. Matter of fact, later in the week, our good friend Jerry Newcomb will be with us. We'll be talking about the Pilgrims, getting kind of ready for Christmas, but I think you'll appreciate that. Next hour, we're going to get into some issues, everything from the abortion pill to some other reactions to the fact that we have a socialist or Marxist mayor, not just in New York City, but now in Seattle, too. I'll get into all of that in just a few minutes. So those are some topics we will be covering. But this first hour, I just thought I might mention and hold up the booklet for November, which is called Political Violence, and it fits very well with a piece that came out just today by Robert Knight. I guess technically it came out yesterday, but it published today in the Washington Times. Where's the Violence? The title is Look to the Left. And he says, we keep being told that both sides of America's political divide are equally culpable for violent rhetoric and violent acts. Goes on to say that's a lie. He says virtually all of this comes from the political left. It wasn't right-wingers who shot President Trump and murdered healthcare executive Brian Thompson in New York and conservative activist Charlie Kirk in Utah. It wasn't young Republicans who attacked Turning Point USA event in the University of California at Berkeley. And if you've seen some of that, it's pretty awful, beating up a Turning Point USA staffer and a variety of other activities. He goes on to talk about some of those if you will, mostly peaceful riots, if you will, in 2020, and then even goes on to quote a number of individuals. And that's why I bring this to you. Sometimes it's one thing for you to hear a Gary Bauer, a Tony Perkins, a variety of others talk about this. It's quite another to see, in this case, John Fetterman, who is a Democrat from the state of Pennsylvania, saying some of this. And he, first of all, quotes from podcaster Joe Rogan, who again probably would not necessarily agree with many things we talk about here on the program, but nevertheless talked about the fact that there were people cheering the killing of Charlie Kirk. He said, quote, Charlie Kirk getting shot and people are celebrating. This might be step 7 on the way to a bona fide civil war, unquote. To his credit, Robert Knight says, I don't think so. This is very different than 1860. But the fact that we have a real division in America and the fact that seemingly one side wants to ignore a lot of violent acts, even some of the anti-Semitic rhetoric and all the other things that come with it, I think it was helpful that the rest of the piece by Robert Knight is quotes from individuals, primarily Senator John Fetterman. He says, for example, that on Wednesday, this was last week, the Pennsylvania Democrat was on CNN's Dana Bash, and Dana Bash, he was telling Dana Bash that radical elements on the left are far more malicious than the other particular side. He said, quote, the difference is the right will say really tough things and call me names, some I won't repeat on TV, but on the left, it's like they really want me to die, unquote. And so Dana Bash had to really come back and say, well, you know, I read your memoir called Unfettered, which I think is a pretty good title, given the fact his name is Fetterman. You said, I've drunk deeply of the venom of both left and right. As a connoisseur, I can confirm that the most poisonous, the bitterest, are from the far left. This is pretty remarkable to hear you say that as an elected Democrat. Why? First of all, let's give credit to Dana Bash asking the question. John Fetterman said, well, it's been my personal experience. And he goes on to talk about the blue ski and all the other blue sky and all that. But anyway, he says, even now, he says, there are people cheering on my next stroke, saying things like, it's terrible that depression didn't win, or I hope your kids find you, meaning find you dead. And of course, he had a fall and had stitches the other day. I think we should be praying for him. But nevertheless, that's from the event with John Fetterman with Dana Bash on CNN. Here's another one with Katie Couric on her podcast, badgering, and as he says, John Fetterman, trying to get him to condemn Charlie Kirk. And if nothing else, she says, I think some people might say that Charlie Kirk's rhetoric was extreme. People condemn political violence, but they also feel a great deal of discomfort with his language, suggesting that these kinds of words lead to violence. John Fetterman, Senator Fetterman, refused to bite and defended Charlie Kirk's right to free speech. And after noting that he didn't often agree with some of the things that Charlie Kirk said, he said, quote, I'm sure we can both agree that you shouldn't shoot people, you shouldn't execute them in public, and you definitely also have the right not to get shot for sharing your views. And so, just a good number of examples that Robert Knight gives. But just before I take a break, let me mention as he pivots to one other issue, and that is what happened after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. We'll be talking about that next hour, interestingly enough, with Caitlin Connors. But you might remember, and Robert Knight reminds us, that after the court overturned Roe v. Wade, you had a group called Jane's Revenge and other groups that went on a spree against crisis pregnancy centers and churches. In 2023 and 2024, there were 900 acts of burning or vandalism against the church, according to Family Research Council. By comparison, and I appreciate Robert and I putting this in there as well, you did have 3 arson attempts at abortion clinics during that time and other acts of vandalism, according to the National Abortion Federation. And then goes on to talk about some of the things from Black Lives Matter, also even going further back, Weather Underground, and a variety of others, but also reminded us that even as much of this was happening in 2020, Democrats cheered or watched without comment for weeks, as he says, as liberal rioters tore up hundreds of cities. Kamala Harris even helped start a bail fund for some of those. And so he says, what's the response to this? Well, what about January 6th? And he said, that's all they've got, and they've been milking it for 5 years. Each act of violence, we talk about this in this booklet, whether coming from the right or left, is not acceptable. And I think it is probably fair to say that conservatives and Republicans have done a little bit better job of calling that out than liberals, progressives, and Democrats. But the booklet is one that we sent out to those of you that are actually Truth Team members. And if you'd like to get a copy, of course, you can let us know. But it's just one of those reasons why I encourage some of you to think seriously about whether or not you might want to support this ministry, because even as the next Outlook magazine goes out about revival and the next booklets go out about another aspect of socialism, those are resources we want to put in your hands. As you support this ministry, we want to equip you and encourage you to make a difference in your community. Anyway, this very good piece by Robert Knight appeared in Washington Times. It's our first article on the website. Go to it, print it out, pass it on to others. Well written, and looking at this issue of violence that we've talked about so often here at Point of View. Got a break? We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The nation has just endured the longest government shutdown in history. News stories focused on everything from flight delays to the interruption of SNAP payments. As some parts of the government return to normal, there is the long-term economic impact of the government shutdown that very few are reporting. Let's go back to Halloween. On October 31st, the Federal Reserve's Repro facility pushed out $29 billion in emergency loans overnight. That was the biggest spike since the 2020 financial crisis. The total for the first few days of November topped $125 billion. The government shutdown was a major reason for this significant injection of liquidity. When 700,000 government employees are not getting paid, it has a secondary effect on the economy. Our taxes, along with other sources of revenue, go into the Treasury General Account. All that money flows through the system to pay bills and to pay government salaries. The money in that account has been skyrocketing. Meanwhile, banks weren't getting as much income because the government workers weren't getting paid. That means mortgages weren't being paid, credit cards weren't being paid, car loans weren't being paid. Banks were starving for liquidity. Bank reserves were at their lowest level in over 4 years. That is why they needed an infusion of funds from the repo facility. But to fund this, the Federal Reserve needed to print more money, often referred to as quantitative easing. The banks have cash and will soon have more as government workers receive their paychecks. What happens when all this cash comes crashing into the U.S. economy? You can probably guess. We'll have all this cash chasing the same amount of goods. We've seen this picture before. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me, if I can, go to our second article in just a minute by Dr. Michael Brown's been on the program with us before. A jarring reminder of our nation's cultural demise. I thought before I get to that, I give you some background, and that has to do with the fact that he wrote this because of the decision by the Supreme Court to not revisit its case on the issue of same-sex marriage. And it's worth having a little bit of a background to understand why he says what he says. Again, since I've been holding up booklets, let me hold this one up, and that is, again, A Biblical View on Same-Sex Marriage, which, of course, we were talking about before the Supreme Court many years ago decided to essentially legalize same-sex marriage. And so after the fact, it occurred to me that there is still going to be a need for us to explain to our children and our grandchildren who are growing up having always believed that same-sex marriage was legal and as normal as a traditional marriage. It gives you some of those arguments. And in there, of course, I give you some of the history. But the history for this particular case that went before the Supreme Court goes back to the appeal from Kim Davis. She was a county clerk in Kentucky. And when the Supreme Court ruled that you could no longer prevent same-sex marriage, she, because of religious objections, was refusing to issue same-sex marriage license. You've heard me in one of my commentaries talk about the fact that she was fined, jailed, lost her job, and all the rest. And even at the time, you have to understand that this decision came down 5-4, which led the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, in his dissent to say, today, 5 lawyers have ordered every state to change their definition of marriage. And he asked, just who do they think we are? But nevertheless, just again, think about this from Kim Davis's perspective. She actually worked as a clerk to actually provide marriage licenses based on the definition of marriage that had existed for millennia. And 5 justices said, nope, you've got to instantaneously change your views on it and start issuing licenses to individuals who want to be married if they're of the same sex or same gender, as they were saying at the time. And so then even Justice Clarence Thomas suggested the idea that they might reconsider the past rulings, but have not done so. And I think it's also worth mentioning that it's hard to get an estimate on how many same-sex marriage couples there are. 823,000 is a number I've come up with, and that's going to be relevant in just a minute when we come to the piece by Michael Brown, because he reminds us of some things that were going on before that decision. He says on November 10th, the Supreme Court declined to reconsider the landmark 2015 Obergefell decision, which radically redefined marriage. This is highly significant since even with the current 6-3 conservative majority, not enough justices were found who were willing to reopen the case, at least not now. maybe in the future. Then he says, again, this is a concern because the marriage was universally understood to be the union of a male and female, and so no matter how much two men or two women loved each other, no matter how committed they were to each other, the union could not be considered marriage. They could be called a civil union, they could be called all sorts of other things. He doesn't say that, but we talk about other alternatives that could have existed. He says, put another way, just as 2 + 2 = 4 is math, not spelling, it was understood that man plus man or woman plus woman was something other than marriage. What could be more basic than that? This is not to deny that there are same-sex couples, he says, who are deeply committed to each other, or deny that many of them are committed parents. That's not the point he's making. That's usually the emotional argument that is given, but it gets back to the fact that the word marriage appears, I think I looked it up one time, in the Federal Register 1,700 times. And with a stroke of a pen, 5 Supreme Court justices changed that definition in every place that it is in the Federal Register and changed every state constitution in the country. So anyway, that's another point to be made later on. But again, Michael Brown says, my point instead is to help us realize how far we've declined on a national, moral, and cultural level, lest we congratulate ourselves for pushing back against radical transgender activism without realizing how much ground has been lost. Because the point he's making is, in other words, while the T in LGBTQ plus activism is under fire, the LGB part of the equation is still firmly entrenched. And he goes on to say that originally, redefining marriage was not even the plan for the early gay activists. So he takes us back to 1971. This is a piece where John Singer and Paul Barwick, 2 Seattle gay men, filed an application to receive a marriage license, and they did it as a political ploy just to ridicule the system because they were not even trying to seek a marriage license from the state of Washington. They were just doing it to, rattle everybody's cage. And then, of course, he quotes, and I sometimes when I speak on this at Bible schools, point out that especially if you go to some of the Australians, he quotes an Australian by the name of Dennis Altman. I quote another woman who was a lesbian Australian. They all made it very, very clear at the time, we really don't want marriage. We really want to destroy marriage because that's the ultimate goal. We think this whole idea of even traditional marriage is ridiculous. And as a result, you found that a lot of individuals that really wanted same-sex marriage never really got married. And there's no surprise to that as well. So he takes us back even further to a 1987 article by gay activist Stephen Warren, who was actually talking about warning to the homophobes, in which he declared, number one, henceforth, homosexuality will be spoken of in your churches and synagogues as an honorable estate. Number two, you can neither let us marry the people of the same sex or, better yet, abolish marriage altogether. Notice the argument there. Number three, you will be expected to offer ceremonies that bless our sexual arrangements. You will also instruct your people in homosexual as well as heterosexual behavior, and you will go out of your way to make certain that homosexual youths are allowed to date, attend religious functions together, openly display affection, and enjoy each other's sexuality without embarrassment or guilt. Number four, if any of the older people in your midst object, you will deal with them sternly, making certain that they renounce their ugly and ignorant homophobia or be subject to public humiliation. Number five, you will also make certain that laws are passed forbidding discrimination against homosexuals and heavy punishments are assigned. And finally, number six, you will, in all likelihood, want to expunge a number of passages from your scriptures and rewrite others. By the way, you probably have seen that there are gay Bibles out there as well. And you would then use homosexual interpretations for Ruth and Boaz and Solomon and Queen of Sheba and David and Jonathan and on and on and on. You've probably seen that before. The Queen James Bible, of course, is one of those homosexual Bibles. But this, I think, was what Michael Brown was trying to explain And that is many of the leaders in the homosexual movement, and he takes us all the way back to 1986, and I can go even further back with some of the articles I've written over the past. But in the 1980s and 90s, as it was getting some momentum, as we get into the 2000s and 2010s, before the final decision coming down from the Supreme Court 10 years ago, you can see that the ultimate goal wasn't so we can get married, although there are some that are married. I just gave you some of those numbers, but rather that we just kind of abolish the whole institution of marriage in the first place. It's based upon fidelity. It's based upon monogamy. Those are old-fashioned ideas. I can hold up my booklet on sex and culture that we've talked about with Carl Truman and the whole sexual revolution. But in some respects, this piece by Michael Brown says you really don't understand how much ground has been lost, and you shouldn't just be patting yourself on the back when we see a little bit of pushback to the transgender agenda, because almost all the rest of it has remained intact, and we're teaching our children something that is not biblical, first of all, certainly going against the norms of history. And again, as I've said before, once you can redefine marriage, well, you certainly can redefine gender and sexuality. And so one followed the other, just as night follows day. I mean, it just is very obvious. So very good piece by Michael Brown. We've had him on the program before talking about everything from the issue of homosexuality to even the great work he's done over the years of Jewish evangelism and much more. If you'd like to read his entire piece, it's our second article on the website at pointofview.net. We come back, though, we're going to spend some time talking about the value of going to historic sites. And, of course, many of those are on the East Coast, but what is so intriguing is the Heritage Foundation has actually found historic sites in all 50 states. And what a great way to teach your children and grandchildren America's godly history. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you go to our website, you notice that we have spent a fair amount of time encouraging you to learn more about America's history, and especially when we come to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Let me hold up some booklets that we've actually addressed. This one here, for example, One Nation Under God, which came out in September. This one, interesting enough, on the Bill of Rights. And you'll also notice when I suggest additional resources, I mentioned some of mine, but also one from the Heritage Foundation, the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, which is now revised. Matthew Spalding's been on with us, and he's a co-author with that as well. So we are certainly wanting you to learn more about America's heritage. We also think it's very important for you to teach your children and grandchildren about that, which is why we're excited to talk about the fact that the Heritage Foundation has put together the Heritage Guide to Historic Sites, Rediscovering America's Heritage Heritage. And what they are actually doing is going to historic sites in all 50 states. I recognize some of you, for example, in California or in Washington or Alaska might be saying, okay, I'm not going to make my way out probably to Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., maybe colonial America. But the good news is, even if you don't, this is a way you can learn these online, which are very helpful. And I think you'll find that there are historic sites even in your own state. So help us understand a little bit more about this. Brenda Hafera is the Assistant Director and Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies. She previously served as the Director of International and Continuing Education at the Fund for American Studies and was also the Assistant Director of the Matthew Ryan Center of Study for Free Institutions and Public Good at Villanova University. Also, I might mention that in addition to that, she holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree, a Bachelor of Science degree, and a Master's in Political Science from Villanova University. Was also a fellow with the Claremont Institute and a James Madison Fellow at Hillsdale College. And so, Brenda, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
Let's, if we can, talk about these different sites, because when I first heard about that, I thought, well, that would be good for people that may be able to travel to Massachusetts or to Pennsylvania or Virginia or a variety of other places. But then you look at the map and realize you have identified historical sites in all 50 states, and you are now even evaluating those. Can you give us some background?
Yeah, sure. So the Heritage Guide to Historic Sites is an online interactive map that pinpoints historic sites all across the country. We have currently released sites in the 13 original colonies, but before the summer of next year, around February of next year, we'll release sites in all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And the evaluations include two things. One is it's really aimed towards families, especially families with young children. So the evaluations include educational resources, considerations for families. They explain the significance of each historic site. And then they give the sites a grade, an A, B, or C, based on how accurate and comprehensive they are, if there's a problem with ideological bias, and if the tours and exhibits are proportional. So we have asked evaluators whose backgrounds match the site themselves. So a poet reviewed Edgar Allan Poe's house, for example, to go to these places and to say if there's any problems with distorting our history, if it's obvious, or if it's sort of those unknowns that you might not know because people are going to historic sites in order to learn.
One of the things I think is so significant is I've been to many of those historical sites, but you also, as you just illustrated a minute ago, have some having to do with, well, Emily Dickinson, which, by the way, was one that didn't get a very good review. But almost all of these do. There's ABC. If you're orange, you're a C. That's not so good. And, of course, what I thought was so intriguing is a lot of these are ones you would expect. You would expect the National Constitution Center. You would expect Mount Vernon. You would certainly expect the Plymouth Foundation, the USS Constitution, and all sorts of things there in Boston, and also even civil rights or Civil War things like, of course, you have the Gettysburg National Military Park and the rest. And so in some of these, you actually maybe have been there, but even if you have not, you can click on any one of these and then get a very clear understanding of that. A question about how many people actually go there each year, whether it's family friendly, what are available in terms of some of the offerings, some suggested readings, and a variety of other things. So this could be, especially for our listeners who have homeschool families, but even if your children are in the public schools, maybe even more important, a thing that could be taught very easily by just pulling up one of the family computers and going through this very detailed list of all these different parks around the country.
You hit the nail on the head, right? So the intention and why we're looking to unfold the full thing by early next year is we want people to go to historic sites to celebrate America 250. We're coming on this very important anniversary when it's time to reflect and rededicate ourselves to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and to relearn our history. So this guide is something that parents and families and teachers can go to before they go on a visit to a historic site to say, what are the things I should be aware of? It might be something like, well, I have young children, and so these tours and exhibits are more age appropriate, more appropriate for the attention span of a young child, so it gives them tips before they plan the visit, and then what to look for on the visit to identify things that are historical distortions that folks may not be aware of, and hopefully bring some accountability to the museum and historic site space. And these sites, it's 250 years of wonderful, rich American history. So it includes things like battlefields. It includes poetry and art. It includes notable figures. And so as a whole, it's a map of the American story, which is one of my favorite aspects of the project.
Let's see if we can maybe just use a few examples, maybe the homes of George Washington and James Madison, maybe Williamsburg. But first of all, the Mount Vernon evaluation was reviewed by you. And it does seem to me that you gave it an A, earns an A because of its careful attention to the legacy and accomplishments of George Washington, consistently balanced tone, and its adherence to scholarly standards, because we're talking about everything from the home to the slave quarters. You tell all the story, and so you give it an A.
That's right. They've incorporated the story appropriately as part of the American story at Mount Vernon, and they do so in an evenly balanced way. Mount Vernon seems really dedicated to relying on primary sources, which is such an important thing when it comes to history. Knowing the primary sources helps you discern between good tellings of history and poor tellings of history. And then they really give adequate attention to George Washington and explain who he was, what he accomplished, why he was so important. So our criteria when it comes to these sites is accuracy and comprehension, ideological bias, and proportionality. So it's our belief that someone should be able to go to one of these sites and go on the main tours and view the main exhibits and come away with a reasonable understanding of why that site is significant. And historic sites can and often should do other things, but they need to fulfill that core responsibility first, and the other things can't overwhelm that core responsibility. That's the proportionality aspect. So that's kind of our methodology, which is on the website. We're very upfront about that, of why a site earns an A, B, or C.
Let me just mention that after the break, we'll talk about the home of James Madison, which did not get an A. It got a C for a couple of very good reasons, not the least of which is it hardly ever mentions James Madison. It has an exhibit on the Constitution that continuously talks about and contentiously portrays the document as pro-slavery, and we'll get into some of that. We'll get into some of the others, but let me just, as we come to a break, recommend that if you would like to take advantage of this, you can go to historicsites.heritage.org, but you don't even have to remember all that, because if you go to the picture of Brenda, you will see right beneath that we have the link to this Heritage Foundation resource, which I think would be very helpful for you as a family, historic sites. And of course, I've been mentioning just the ones with the country's founding or the framing of the Constitution, but as we just mentioned, we have Civil War battlefields and all sorts of historical elements of that as well. So if you find yourself saying, okay, this is good, one of these things that we need to do this year is try to educate ourselves and our children and our grandchildren about some of the important principles. That's why, again, I hold up some of the booklets that we've already made available, and many more to come, by the way, as well as this particular Heritage Guide to Historic Sites, Rediscovering America's Heritage. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about for just a few more minutes, the Heritage Guide to Historical Sites, Rediscovering America's Heritage. And Brenda, I thought we might for just a minute mention the fact that even though Monticello is not exactly getting an A, certainly we can talk about the fact that Mount Vernon gets an A, but the homes for Thomas Jefferson and James Madison don't. And James Madison probably the worst on the list. And since you were a James Madison Fellow at Hillsdale College, and since you did the review, I thought it would be good to have you explain why that one is so far down the list compared to, say, Mount Vernon and some of the other historical sites.
Sure. So the biggest issue with Montpelier is there's not adequate attention to James Madison, who was incredibly important. He is deemed the father of the Constitution because he wrote the Virginia Plan, which is the bones of the Constitution at the debates. He wrote many of the Federalist Papers, which ensured passing of the Constitution, and then wrote the Bill of Rights. So he's an incredibly important figure and contributed a lot to America. And there are no exhibits dedicated to James Madison at Montpelier there today. And some of the exhibits are quite informative and interesting. Almost all of the exhibits are on slavery, race, and Jim Crow, but they also, many of them engage in cherry picking and historical distortion. The exhibit on the Constitution, which could be used to explain why the Constitution is the oldest written constitution in the world, what's remarkable about that document, seeks to portray the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. And it ignores Madison's own words on the topic, which again, primary sources are incredibly important. And just to give you one example of the distortions, they point to the domestic violence and insurrection clauses of the Constitution and say those are about slave revolts, which they certainly would have applied to slave revolts. But the founders really had in mind Shays' Rebellion, which showed that the Articles of Confederation were too weak and that the government needed those basic powers. And Madison says that. And then to prove their thesis, they list 5 slave revolts, and 3 of those revolts happened after the Constitution was written. So it couldn't have had any effect on the words of that document. So those are the kinds of distortions that they engage in, where if you're someone who's going to learn, no one is an expert in everything, right? If you're going to learn, you might look at that and say, well, that's interesting, and not recognize actually they're cherry picking and they're not adequately portraying history.
Let's, if we can, maybe just talk about one other, and Colonial Williamsburg. Of course, you have evaluated that as well. A good maybe revelation is that I've always been very fond of what is happening there, and really for decades have been a donor to the Williamsburg Foundation. You give it a B, but again, recognize that this is a place where you can think of all sorts of things, where Patrick Henry proclaimed, "Give me liberty or give me death." We talk about some of the homes. George Mason's home is there. Just all sorts of things that give you a sense of what it was like to actually have lived in that 18th century when a lot of this was taking place. But again, what's your analysis of a place like Colonial Williamsburg?
So I think Colonial Williamsburg is straying. It's I would say in the middle between Mount Vernon and Montpelier, and it gets a B. So the issue with Colonial Williamsburg is they're losing a bit of their unique history of, I like to say it's all the beginnings and ends of the American Revolution, right? They're debating whether or not they should separate in Colonial Williamsburg, and then George Washington gathers the troops there before the Battle of Yorktown. And so it's an incredibly important place, and the figures who represent George Mason or James Madison, who stand up and give sort of 30-minute monologues and tell you who they are, why they're important. I think that's a great thing that Colonial Williamsburg does, but that has been sidelined in recent years. So there's a proportionality problem of not focusing on what really makes that place unique, not focusing on the American founders and adequately telling their story. And then there's some ideological problems where they've done things like incorporate LGBTQ plus history. They hosted a teacher's workshop where teachers could get continuing education credits with the New York Historical Society on teaching queer history, which, teaching it would have applied to grade school children. And they've done things in their theater programs like host stage events where two women have eloped. These women were in England, and so there's actually no tie to Colonial Williamsburg as far as I can tell, and they hosted this as a stage production there. So there are those sorts of issues, and we try to alert parents to that sort of thing of, if you're going during Pride Month, they are engaging in Pride celebrations at Colonial Williamsburg.
Mm-hmm. And again, I think we've given you an A, B, and a C to see that. Just before I wind down, let me just mention that one of the other things I appreciate, having been to many of these presidential museums, the Gerald Ford Museum, for example, in Michigan, the Nixon Museum in Yorba Linda, of course, even the Ronald Reagan Museum in Simi Valley, and many, many others. The Eisenhower Museum is there in Kansas. There are some great opportunities. There are also, of course, a number of these different battlefields. Some of those are Civil War battlefields, even going back to the Battle at the Alamo and many others. So this is a way in which wherever you live in the country, you can maybe go to some of these historic sites and learn. But even if you don't, one of the goals you have, I believe, Brenda, is for people to go to historicsites.heritage.org or just simply follow the link that we have there, and they can use that teaching right there in their home. And then, of course, they can find all sorts of videos out there which give you the next best experience to going to some of these places. And I just think that it's outstanding that you've put together this historic list of sites, but now are going through systematically and evaluating them and warning us of any ideological bias. So, first of all, just 3 cheers for what you're doing. But again, if people want to use this, they can simply go to the website, can't they?
That's right, historicsites.heritage.org. And I will remind folks, we have about 45 sites on the list right now, but we're set to have about 135 in February of next year, Washington's birthday. So tune back in to see when you're planning your summer vacations for this coming summer, America's 250th anniversary. Please step back to this historicsites.heritage.org to better inform that planning and better inform your experience when you go to these historic sites.
Well, again, thank you for joining us. And again, I wanted all of our listeners to know about that. Once again, we can talk about the homes of certain individuals, certain particular areas like the Pilgrim Colony, or, of course, the Colonial Williamsburg. We have some that are historical in terms of authors. We mentioned just a minute ago the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum, some of the historic sites. And as she pointed out, right at the moment, 45 sites displayed on the map, but the goal is to have even more. So again, go to our website, pointofview.net, and you can find all the information that you need to know about, because we are really dedicated to doing what we can to educate you and your children and grandchildren about America's godly heritage. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to change topics, as you might imagine. First of all, we're going to be talking about this whole idea of chemical abortion, and once we do so, Caitlin Connors will be with us. There's a new poll that's come out. Then we'll get back into a couple other issues in the news before we wind down, but all of it can be found at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about this issue of chemical abortion. We've talked about it so often, with especially some of the great material that Liberty McCarter has written about. But as you well know, if you've been listening to this program, the way in which some of the procedures and policies were implemented under the Biden administration, those are controversial for many reasons, and we're going to get into that because of a new poll that helps us understand that that isn't just the view held around the table or by those of you that maybe or see yourself as pro-life, but many others are concerned about that as well. We have a majority of U.S. senators, they're Republicans, by the way, who have called upon the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services to act, so we'll get into that. But to explain this poll and the whole issue, we bring to the microphone Caitlin Connors. She is a native of Birmingham, Alabama, one of the places where we broadcast, by the way, and is a graduate of the University of Alabama and was chair of her college Republican chapter, then went to Washington, D.C., working with our good friends at the Susan B. Anthony List back in February of 2016, served as a political coordinator and political director, has moved back, of course, to have a baby boy, as well as now serving as the Southern Regional Director for the Susan B. Anthony List. And Caitlin, welcome to Point of View.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful for the time and the opportunity.
Let's see if we can talk about this poll. This is one of many press releases that people can find from Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America. 7 in 10 voters want to roll back Biden COVID abortion drug policy and reinstate in-person doctor visits. Can you give us a little bit of a history? Because that's helpful to recognize that we went from a time in which we had very significant limits on these abortion drugs to a time in which it was just sort of open season. And that's, I think, illustrated by the fact that you have members of Congress and even most Americans who say we've gone too far.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the poll you referenced really does shine a light on the common sense measures that we are talking about here. So, yeah, a little bit of the background. Previously, before the Biden administration, there were what are called essentially risk protocols. Risk protocols are on drugs, not for abortion, but for drugs across the board that Americans might use. And they simply inform the patient of what risks are involved with taking that medication. And so under the Biden administration, in the name of COVID and everything having to be virtual, they took away the risk protocols for the abortion drug, namely taking away that in-person requirement for receiving the abortion drug. So when you think about that in practical terms, what we're saying is, or what the Biden administration said, is that it's not necessary to go visit a doctor in person and have an ultrasound done. They can just see you via telemedicine, for example, and mail you the pills. That's problematic for so many different reasons, of course, namely knowing how far along in the pregnancy you even are. The complication rate soars the longer in the pregnancy that a woman is when she takes these pills. So there are so many practical reasons why having that in-person requirement is necessary. And so now we are in a position where we are still living under those Biden administration changes with these risk protocols. And so we are calling as a movement that those risk protocols at a minimum be immediately put back in place. Of course, we don't want to see these drugs exist. We obviously believe in the sanctity of all life and want to protect the unborn, and these pills are directly designed to terminate a pregnancy. But at a minimum, can we not put back the regulations that we had in place under the first Trump administration? And that is what we're calling on, and what this polling suggests the vast majority of Americans also agree with.
And again, just to give people a little bit of a sense of why this is such a great concern. First of all, again, we don't think any abortion is right, but bottom line is, even if you wanted to have a safe environment, safe, legal, and rare, as we used to hear, the ER rate visits after chemical abortions were made available increased 500% since 2002. 1 in 5 women who take abortion pills will experience so much bleeding that they would require medical attention. And of course, we can also talk about the possibility of an ectopic pregnancy, which is deadly. There are so many reasons that, Caitlin, I've said before, maybe you agree or disagree, that if this set of pills were provided for anything other than abortion, there would be outrage and a call for what we're talking about here, because we wouldn't allow this kind of, if you will, medical malpractice against women in any other area, but we sort of turn a blind eye to the issue of abortion. What are your thoughts?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think you've summed it up well. Because we're talking about abortion, the narrative immediately shifts. But you're right. If we were talking about any other kind of medication on the market, there would be an absolute panic to know that women have been so adversely affected, not to mention the unborn child, but just from those complication factors that you mentioned there, knowing whether or not a woman has an ectopic pregnancy, meaning that the baby is forming outside of the uterus. That is going to lead to many complications. But if she takes the abortion pill with an ectopic pregnancy, those complications skyrocket. We've seen so many cases of women coming into the emergency room, and they're being actively told by their abortion provider to say, "Oh, I'm having a miscarriage." So we don't even have the full picture of the range of women who are going into the emergency room with complications of these drugs. That's just what we know based on the states that do require reporting. And as you can imagine, those pro-abortion states that exist out there in our country, unfortunately, don't require as much in-depth reporting as we would like to see. So we only have a glimpse of the whole picture, and the glimpse that we have is horrific. So we know the numbers are larger than they are. We know the complication rates must be higher than they are. And for an industry like the abortion industry, like Planned Parenthood, who has for years and years gotten away with the tagline of being for women's health and for women's reproductive freedom, to also be the face of pushing to allow for abortion drugs to be mailed to women in the mail from doctors who cannot be held accountable. For all we know, in many cases, they don't even have to be licensed medical providers. We are talking about states, who have pro-abortion laws in their state, including shield laws that protect them when they break a pro-life state's law. And we're also talking about foreign violators as well. So these pills are coming in the mail. They're being sent to women. There's unfortunately been many, many cases, and you can only imagine, and your viewers can only imagine, the extent to which this can get out of hand. But imagine a disgruntled ex-boyfriend. Imagine a human trafficker.
We need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Caitlin Connors. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The nation has just endured the longest government shutdown in history. News stories focused on everything from flight delays to the interruption of SNAP payments. As some parts of the government return to normal, there is the long-term economic impact of the government shutdown that very few are reporting. Let's go back to Halloween. On October 31st, the Federal Reserve's Repro facility pushed out $29 billion in emergency loans overnight. That was the biggest spike since the 2020 financial crisis. The total for the first few days of November topped $125 billion. The government shutdown was a major reason for this significant injection of liquidity. When 700,000 government employees are not getting paid, it has a secondary effect on the economy. Our taxes, along with other sources of revenue, go into the Treasury General Account. All that money flows through the system to pay bills and to pay government salaries. The money in that account has been skyrocketing. Meanwhile, banks weren't getting as much income because the government workers weren't getting paid. That means mortgages weren't being paid, credit cards weren't being paid, car loans weren't being paid. Banks were starving for liquidity. Bank reserves were at their lowest level in over 4 years. That is why they needed an infusion of funds from the Repro facility. But to fund this, the Federal Reserve needed to print more money, often referred to as quantitative easing. The banks have cash and will soon have more as government workers receive their paychecks. What happens when all this cash comes crashing into the U.S. economy? You can probably guess. We'll have all this cash chasing the same amount of goods. We've seen this picture before. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk with Caitlin Connors about this issue of chemical abortion and this survey that was done. And Caitlin, you kind of raised all sorts of issues. So let's see if we can break them down in terms of the poll. The first one is, of course, the idea that I've already illustrated, that 7 in 10 voters approve of requiring doctors to screen for and report signs of any coercion. As you mentioned just a minute ago, it could be a boyfriend or abuse or something like that. When this is done by sending it through the mail, you, of course, don't have any observation of the particular circumstance that the pregnant woman is under. You also don't have any sense of whether or not there's coercion or abuse. And so I think that's why a large majority of Americans understand the value, if you're going to prescribe these drugs, which we disagree with, at the very least require somebody who is a trained physician or clinician or something to have some kind of oversight of what is taking place.
Absolutely, yeah. So, so this poll is showing 70% of Americans, and the majority of them, by the way, polled, consider themselves to be pro-choice. Because, here, what we're looking at, even this baseline fundamental question, hey, should abortion pills be mailed to women without any sort of medical oversight? And the common sense answer to that is, well, no. If we're for women's safety and health, we should make sure that that same standard of care that would be given under any other kind of medical condition or surgery or any other type of ailment, not that pregnancy is an ailment, you, of course, agree with me there, but in terms of talking about just this baseline question of should women be able to receive adequate medical care? And that's what we're talking about here with the erasure of these risk protocols. What we are allowing in this country right now is for abusers to be able to go online to order pills. They can lie about who they are. They don't have to speak to a medical doctor. They don't have to verify anything. They can have these pills mailed to them. And unfortunately, we have seen a few cases now of either, ex-boyfriends or things like that, slipping these pills into girlfriends' drinks without their awareness, intentionally trying to end their pregnancy when the girlfriend or wife, whatever the case may be, was not wanting to terminate this pregnancy. So the door that has been opened for this new form of domestic violence, essentially, is incredibly alarming, and of course, the absolute opposite of women's health. So the majority of Americans, 70% of Americans, agree. An in-person consultation, an in-person ultrasound at a minimum, just makes common sense. Make sure we know how far along in the pregnancy this woman is and those complication rates that come from taking these pills later in pregnancy. Or make sure we know that she is not, doesn't have an ectopic pregnancy. Make sure she's being given the proper medical care that would affect her future pregnancies. In some cases, taking these pills without proper medical examination and things that would be normally caught on your first doctor's visit when you go and have an ultrasound, all of that goes out the door when we don't require that. So we have in the situation that we're in now, under the same Biden administration rules, we are allowing for every day, not just unborn babies to be put at risk, but for women as well. And so this poll really speaks strongly to knowing that the American people, even pro-choice voters out there, realize that there are dangers that come with these abortion drugs, and women at least deserve to be able to fully understand the situation when taking these pills and being put in the best proper medical care.
Let me also talk about something where, again, pro-life, pro-choice, I think, would agree, and that is the problem with abortion drug poisoning. Dr. Merrill Matthews has been on the program many times, as a matter of fact, with us on Friday, and he's pointed out before that some of the drugs, if they don't come from a formulary, you can't be sure that these didn't come from a foreign country and may actually engage in all sorts of deceptive or even defective kinds of manufacture, and you've had problems with that as well, haven't we?
Yeah, we've heard several accounts from pregnancy centers across the country who are saying, women were shipped these pills. They came in a nondescript package. There's no instructions. And then it begs the question, well, how do you even know that it's the pill that they say it is? In some cases, it's been a placebo. In other cases, it has either been the abortion drug or a larger quantity than perhaps is necessary. And again, with no instructions on how to take it or what some of the side effects might be, when you should go to the hospital. And while we may not have seen this exact case yet, it really, again, has to have us concerned when we see things like fentanyl being shipped from across our borders. Yes. And these other drugs that come in from across state lines. Like, what are we allowing to happen in the name of reproductive rights? Every sane argument, every common sense argument goes directly against what this all allows for. And so that's why we see, 80% of voters in this poll agree that is certainly a concern, and making sure we at least know where these pills come from, that they are what they say that they are, at a minimum. Again, when we're talking about this is intended to be health care, which of course we know as pro-lifers, abortion is not health care. But for the abortion industry to be able to get away with that lie over and over for years and years and still be the people who are saying that we should be able to ship these pills in the mail without any sort of oversight is laughable, of course, dangerous and reckless as well.
Well, also, of course, you found that 9 out of 10 approve of requiring the FDA drug labels to accurately report the real-world impact. And Senator Lindsey Graham and others have sent letters to the HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the FDA Commissioner Marty Makary to deal with these issues. So you've got very good information here to actually motivate individuals in Congress, and especially in the U.S. Senate, to actually take some action in this regard. And so this is why we wanted, first of all, people to know about that, but also I wanted them to know about what is actually taking place right now at Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America. It's SBA prolife.org. You don't have to remember all that because we have the link on the website. If you're traveling right now, don't need to write that down, but you will find the link. And in addition to these surveys, you're doing quite a bit of surveying of candidates so that we can make sure that we have pro-life members of Congress addressing this issue, because as important as this poll is, we need to get the right candidates. And that's one of the things that Marjorie Dannenfelser and all of you there at Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America have been working on for many years.
That's absolutely right. We announced last week, in fact, that we are putting $80 million worth of an investment into the midterm elections. And the idea directly behind that is exactly what you said, to make sure that we have pro-life candidates then go on to represent us in the House and the Senate and in governor's offices across the country. A lot of our states, Texas included, have gone as far as they can, at least for right now, in protecting life. And so what we want to do, while we want them to maintain those pro-life laws, we want them to do as much as they can to save every last unborn life. We know that every single day they are being undermined by blue states, New York, California, Illinois, who are openly protected by their so-called shield laws that allow them to break the laws in our pro-life states. We have to have both our states doing everything they can to protect life and Washington, D.C. Being bold and taking action to protect life as well. When it comes to the abortion drugs, at a minimum, we have to put these risk protocols back in place to at least get these drugs, for the most part, out of the mail. We want to see all of these drugs taken off the market. Of course, we're pro-life. We don't want to see one unborn life taken. But at a minimum, what can we do to mitigate the incredible risk that we have out there? Women are being hurt on a daily basis, and they're being lied to about abortion generally as an answer to their problems. And they're being lied to that these pills are safe and a way for them to get out of a situation that they're unsure of. It's a lie to women. We can do better as a country. Yes. So we're going to elect pro-life lawmakers who are going to take that message to Washington and take bold action. And we are grateful for the leadership that we do have, as you mentioned.
Thank you.
All Senate Republicans signed on to that letter.
Again, we have all that information on the website. Again, SBA prolife.org, and you can click on the button that says Take Action or News. You'll find all that you need, and we're going to take a break. Be back with more right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. Let me just mention as program note that Andrew Asengor will be with us tomorrow, and we'll be talking about his book, How to Remember. We'll get into a few other things that are related to what I'm going to spend some time now talking about, and that is the issue of socialism. And there's a very good reason for it. First of all, we don't just have a socialist mayor in New York City. We now for sure have a socialist mayor in Seattle, Washington, and many others that serve on city councils. Now, that is reason enough to go to this next article by Mark Lewis, what New York City has to look forward to. What is the future of New York City under a Marxist mayor? I think he goes into some detail about that. But we've also recognized how important it is to not just see this as a one-off or with the Seattle a two-off, but one of the things we're going to provide in the future, we don't have it scheduled yet, is an interview with our good friend George Barna. And he has done a survey in which he points out that a good number of church goers are tipping towards socialism. You think I'm making that up? No. Of people who are regular attenders of church, 32%, or basically a third, prefer socialism over capitalism. And I understand some of the reasons for that. Again, I'll hold up some of the booklets we've done on socialism and even one on capitalism and socialism. Certainly, the one on capitalism and socialism illustrates again that if you think the economy we have right now is a free market capitalist economy, then I can understand why you'd be frustrated, because the word that is used by Zoran Mamdani and many others is affordability. And this culture isn't affordable. But it isn't because we have a free market. It's because we have a crony capitalist market. We have one that is controlled by a Federal Reserve. That's our November issue of Outlook. It is controlled by individuals who actually can monitor the money supply, and thus individuals who have assets benefit much more than people who do not. And as a result, you see the wage gap increasing. And I understand why people would say, well, if this is what the free market is, I can't even buy a house. I could barely afford groceries and all sorts of other things. I can't even pay my rent. All the kinds of issues that we've surfaced on this program before, I can certainly sense why people might think that socialism is the solution. And even in this booklet I've got here on socialism, Biblical View on Socialism, the picture that our graphic artist picked is where a person's carrying a sign that says socialism is the cure. No, it's not. It's the disease, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So I've got this piece by Mark Lewis. We'll focus on that. After the break, I've got another good piece by our good friend Gary Bauer. He wrote this for the James Dobson Family Institute. Jesus wasn't a socialist, so we'll get to that in just a minute. But it's just an illustration of why I think we're going to have to get into some detail and provide some counter programming and some answers and information that a lot of young people and even some older people don't understand. But let's see what Mark Lewis has to say. He says, New York City, of course, has recently elected a Marxist Muslim as a mayor of the city. How much of either a Marxist or Islam, Zoran Mamdani, will be able to impose on the city is yet to be determined, but that is what he calls himself. Marxism, as I shall demonstrate, is an all-encompassing world philosophy. Its main emphasis is on economics, but there is a, if you will, package deal. Now, he goes into some detail. This is going to be a short summary of about 5 pages of material, but let's, if we can, see if we can explain what Marxism is, and then ask maybe the question, how much of that will an individual who calls himself a democratic socialist will try to implement? The first is, of course, the abolition of private property. If you've read the Communist Manifesto, and this kind of brings me back, the very first time I was on with Marlon Maddox, and that was almost 50 years ago, interestingly enough. I had just graduated from Georgetown University, and for some reason we got talking about the Communist Manifesto, and I started reciting portions of it to Marlon, and he was shocked. But here, again, let's just simply read from the Communist Manifesto itself. The theory of communism, Karl Marx said, may be summed up in one sentence: abolish all private property. That's, of course, the first point of the Communist Manifesto. And Zoran Mamdani has said that he believes that. Of course, when they mean private property, sometimes he says it's private property that is for me, but not for thee. And of course, you've always had, as he points out, communism has had a ruling class. They actually end up doing quite well. But the other peasants, if you will, the hoi polloi, the lower class, don't do so well. So when somebody says, I believe that we should get rid of private property, or we need to significantly constrain that, or when you have the World Economic Forum say you will own nothing and be happy, they're not kidding when they say that. Take them at their word. Number two is the destruction of religion. Again, communism says my object is to dethrone God and to destroy capitalism. Communism begins where atheism begins. And this, again, is the first prerequisite for the idea of communism, because it's seen as the happiness of people, which leads not only to the abolition of private property, but the abolition of religion. And again, one of the questions that maybe Zoran Mamdani is going to have to deal with is there are two conflicting ideas. One, Marxist, which is atheistic at its core, and Islam, which, if supposedly he's devout Muslim, what does that mean? So we will see how that plays out in terms of, do you believe in Islam or Marxist economics? We'll see where that goes. Number three is increased and destructive taxation. Again, Karl Marx wrote, a heavy or progressive or graduated income tax is necessary for the proper development of communism. Well, of course, we've already heard that. Zoran Mamdani has already indicated that he wants to raise taxes, and he has been quite explicit about what he wants to do. Of course, this is part of what we inherited during what was called the Progressive Era, which gave us the 16th Amendment, and also, of course, now we even have a lot of it being run by, of course, those individuals back in 1913 that established even a central bank. But again, as he points out, Mark Lewis, the Democratic Party has never seen a tax it doesn't like. So again, we're already a little further down with 3 points, but let's take a few more. Number four, education. Again, going back to the Communist Manifesto, the education of all children from the moment they can get along without a mother's care shall be state institutions. This idea that children are the wards of a state goes all the way back to Marxism and socialism. As long as, Mark Lewis says, education remains in the hands of government, and especially in the hands of those people that have a leftist ideology, who have actually controlled it for the last 100 years, the American people will be dumber and actually be more likely to be enslaved to the government. Another one is the issue of terror. You got to admit, Karl Marx was honest about this. We have no compassion, and we ask no compassion from you. When our turn comes, we shall not make excuses for the terror. because Karl Marx was very honest about the fact that people will not give up their freedoms easily unless forced to do so, and that has called for terror, which has happened multiple times in communist dictatorships over the past 100 years. And my booklet on socialism documents the 24 different experiments, and none of them have ended well. And then the final one is Marxist makes the rules. For Marxism, nothing is final, absolute, and sacred, and this ultimately is the reason why. If there is no God, there are no eternal truths, there are no absolute truths. We make up morality as we go along, and the communist morality often requires terror and many times has even led to mass murder. So again, this is just a reminder that if you call yourself a Marxist, well, we read the Marxist Bible. It's called the Communist Manifesto. Of course, I've read others as well. Graduate School, Das Kapital, and all sorts of other ones that have been part of the Marxist regime. I had to read Karl Marx. I had to read Lenin. I had to read Stalin. I had to read Mao. This is familiar territory, and it's very dark. And so when a person calls themselves a democratic socialist, they may point to maybe a Scandinavian country, which really aren't, and they want to try to turn a blind eye to everything from North Korea, China, Russia, Venezuela, and many other countries. But the piece by Mark Lewis reminds us this might be what New York is in for, and that's why we are going to talk about it right here on Point of View. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I thought I'd wind down with a piece by Gary Bauer. Of course, he's a good friend of this ministry, and he posted this the other day. Jesus wasn't a socialist, and I think you might go, well, yeah, that's kind of obvious, but it isn't so obvious because both the booklets, one on capitalism and socialism and the one on a biblical view on socialism that I've written over the years, has a section on, doesn't the book of Acts teach socialism? And so in some respects, Gary felt the need to write this, and we might even post it in the future in our Outlook magazine or something like that, but we've posted it right now on the website, pointofview.net. And Gary says there's a growing effort by political forces on the left to convince Christians that socialism and its father, Marxism, are closely aligned with the teachings of Jesus. He says nothing could be further from the truth. Nonetheless, this is a lie gaining adherents. Christians must be discerning to avoid being deceived. Well, there's two issues. First of all, he talks about the fact that there are socialist parties in Europe. And what I think is so intriguing is that in order to sort of make their peace with that, some of the Christians who maybe aren't as well taught will say, well, socialism believes in treating everyone as you'd like to be treated. So that's the golden rule. It's certainly trying to help the downtrodden. So after all, Christian socialism, that makes some sense. And so you start hearing topics about Christian socialism. And I encountered that literally decades ago. There were these little booklets that were coming out of Europe, which were written from supposedly a Christian point of view. And I started noticing that they were not necessarily taking a very strong stand on everything from abortion to homosexuality, and then they started putting out booklets on, why Christians should support unions. And I thought, well, that's not necessarily a religious issue left or right anyway, but okay. And then finally just, they started making arguments for Christian socialism. So we've seen that in Europe, and he talks about that because there is really a focus, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But as I just shared a minute ago, George Barna has found that even in churches in America, at least a third of the individuals think socialism is preferable to capitalism. And so again, Gary Bauer reminds us that socialism is a purely economic system that redistributes wealth. The followers claim that socialism helps the poor, promotes equity and fairness, is built on compassion compassion and empathy, hence the reason why it's being promoted even as something that Christians should support. So in the next paragraph, he says socialist platforms today really are much bigger than economics. And that's really important to recognize that a socialist worldview, a Marxist worldview, is an all-encompassing worldview. It isn't just dealing with economics. And he says, for example, socialist parties and left-wing parties across Western Europe and here in the United States are radically pro-abortion. The Democratic Party in the United States is the home of most socialists, and it's totally devoted, as he says, to abortion on demand for any reason. There was once, he said, a pro-life caucus among Democrats, but now really no elected Democratic members of Congress or the Senate can call themselves pro-life. So first of all, socialism connects up with something we just talked about a minute ago with Caitlin Connors, and that is abortion. He goes on to say socialist movements here and across Western Europe are also fully committed to LGBTQ ideology. Well, that connects up with some of the things we talked about last hour with Michael Brown. And again, socialist Democrats promote that ideology in the schools, and even some of the teacher unions here have promoted it as well. He says in any community where leftists and socialists take control of a school board, they relegate the parents to the sidelines. Why? We just talked about that. Once a parent no longer is needed, in other words, once the child is autonomous, they will be considered, from a Marxist point of view, wards of the state. Let's continue. He says socialists also translate into bigger government that attempts to regulate every aspect of our lives. Big government sees the family as an impediment to its power. Parents, as he points out, that stood up to school districts across the country protesting some of these radical theories were actually attacked or at least labeled by the Biden administration as domestic terrorists and things of that nature. By contrast, he says Christianity teaches that we as parents have a right and a responsibility to raise our children. We are called to protect our children from evil. Another aspect of socialism, and we've talked about this with Kelly Shackelford, that is religious liberty also suffers under socialist and left-wing governments. In socialist Europe, religious liberty is under constant attack. People have been arrested for praying audibly and even silently in their minds outside of abortion clinics. Religious liberty in the United States has been under attack since the mid-1960s, when school prayer and Bible reading were ruled unconstitutional. And as a result, as we've pointed out before with Gary Bauer, as well as with Kelly Shackelford, once the government has to be the authority, anything that rivals its authority, that could be the church, could be the belief in God, could be the family, those need to be relegated to second-class status or simply eliminated. And finally, he says all of this, a pro-abortion, pro-homosexual ideology, hostility to parental rights, and attacks on religious liberty should be enough to understand that socialism is not in any way consistent with what God has revealed in His Word. No Christian can ignore these facts in deciding who they vote for. Nowhere, he says, in the Gospels does Christ advocate for big government to take money and assets from one group of people and give it to another. One of the 10 Commandments says, "Thou shalt not steal." I would have added one more, Gary. Also, the last of the 10 Commandments says, "Thou shalt not" what? Covet, because that's what is behind much of this as well. And so he ends by simply reminding us that socialists and left-wing candidates like Zohran Mamdani rely heavily on promises of free things and benefits to buy voters, but there's no such thing as free. Somebody has to pay for everything. In addition, he says, the evidence is overwhelming that many well-meaning welfare programs have not helped the poor, but instead have created dependency on government handouts that undermine the chance of escaping poverty. Well, as we wind down, let me just mention that this particular article by Gary Bauer might be one that you would like to select, maybe print it out, pass it around to others. Maybe you know some people in your own church that think, maybe socialism is better than capitalism. I don't like what this capitalist economy has done to me and my family, so maybe I'm ready to accept socialism, because after all, maybe it's Christian after all. This piece, or of course some of the booklets we have, would be some resources that we certainly want to put in your hands. And if you kind of wonder where New York City is going, where Seattle, Washington is going, well, this piece by Mark Lewis, The Future of New York, I think would be a good one. And of course, we've also posted a very good piece by Michael Brown about same-sex marriage, and by Caitlin Connors about the abortion pill poll. So lots of great resources that we have available to you on the website is pointofview.net. And of course, we talked with Brenda Hafera about the fact that you can even learn a little bit more about some of these historic sites around the country. The Heritage Guide to Historic Sites, all available on our website at pointofview.net. I think you've seen we've covered a lot of topics. We're going to do the same thing tomorrow, cover a lot more. And if you find yourself wanting some of this information, it's available free of charge on the website at pointofview.net. I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.